Austin ISD recently closed 4 campuses permanently, including Brook and Metz in D2, and 8 more were discussed as possible closures at a later date. Specifically looking at Brook and Metz elementaries, what have you learned about school closures during this process, and how would you approach future decisions regarding school closures as a trustee? The order will be Ophelia, Andy, and then John, and you'll each have 2 minutes. We'll begin with Ophelia. The mute is on.
What I have learned through the campaign process is that parents in the community were not heard, that it was already a decision made from the top, as it's always been. It's a top-down way of making decisions in this district. They have community meetings for the sake of saying we had community meetings, but they're not really listening to the community. And so part of what needs to change is that there needs to be some respect for the community's voice and to be part of the decision makers of anything that's going on in their campus. And, you know, they say we want community engagement, but that definition is not the same definition as I see as community engagement, where you really invite people at the table and everybody is being part of the solution. And so that's what I would want to change, is that the community be respected and always be part of what is going on, what is coming down at the beginning, not at the end, and that they are the experts of that community. They're the experts of the children's education. And so the district needs to begin to really listen and engage so that there will be a successful district and rebuilding of those relationships of trust so that we can be a role model district for other school districts.
Thank you. Andy, please.
Okay, thank you. Well, first of all, the process by which they want to do school closures was not perfect. It was not perfect because, first of all, we did not look at, did we do everything else beforehand before we even considered closing schools? And that's why I relate to boundaries. We could have looked at boundaries for District 2 and really across the entire district to kind of help load balance that before we even started the discussion about closing schools. But even serving as co-chair of the Boundary Advisory Committee for the district, that was not our charge. It's like we're given specific instructions on what we're to work on, even though we know there are other issues out there that could actually impact those things in the district. Because as I've said before, what happens in one area impacts everything within the district. So, so that should have been the first thing we looked at, which we were not able to do. The second thing, which I think is really more critical, is communication. When it comes to communication in the district, it is not about the parents being on the district's time to get feedback and input. The district needs to understand they need to be on the parents' time because we have children, we need to feed them, we need to make sure they're taken care of before we can actually get engaged in those other things that are impacting their success and their education. So I think going forward, if I would do anything different, is that before we even start talking about school closures, let's make sure we have crossed all those other paths with community engagement and input first before doing so. Because I believe that if the learning is the same across the entire district, no matter which school you're at, then by balancing the load across the district at the schools, you will get the same quality education on the east side of Austin as you would on the west side of Austin. Thank you.
Thank you. And John, let me just read the question for you once again here. Austin ISD recently closed 4 campuses permanently, including Brook and Metz in D2, and 8 more were discussed. Specifically looking at Brook and Metz, what have you learned about school closures during this process, and how would you approach future decisions regarding school closures as a trustee?
The first thing I'd like to point out is that there was actual community engagement in the process. The question is, which communities were engaged? The director of the FABPAC committee, Jennifer Littlefield and Leticia Moreno Caballero, were deeply involved in crafting the FABPAC proposals, bringing in people from different places, where they suggested that certain schools needed to be closed because it would cost too much to keep them going. FABPAC also said that every measure needs to be taken before schools are closed, but they made a ringing reason to start closing schools, which is the reasons why Ted Gordon, Jamie Matias, and Paul Saldana all voted against the recommendations of FABPAC, yet the school district went ahead over the districts where the schools would be closed. So there was community engagement, but it was their vision of what a quality school would be. Those quality schools were glass walls, open classrooms, and kind of a panopticon where supervisors can see what's going on, recipe for distraction for students. So people were caught up in the vision of these schools, but not actually consulting parents with kids with SPED, not actually consulting teachers about what kind of school they would want. And third of all, I don't think they value the kind of education that these smaller, more politically vulnerable schools provide. These are anchors. These are places where parent support specialists are the heroes of the district. These are places where parents go out of the way looking for food and other things to get people going. They're part of the home that people make in Austin, whether you're transferring from Del Valley, transferring from Manor, or just crossing district lines to be part of these smaller schools because your grandparents went to these schools. This value is priceless, and instead FABPAC and the school closures put a price on real estate, not realizing that real estate is going to be much more expensive 5 years, 10 years, 20 years down the line when parents will start putting their kids back into Austin ISD.
Thank you all. Let me issue a follow-up question. If anyone would like to answer, please just raise your hand and you'll have a minute to respond to it. With Metz Elementary, they were co-campusing with another school, and part of their move was moving into newer buildings. For Brook, it was a different scenario. I'd like you to speak specifically to your experience with families at Brook and their students, and what you've learned from engaging with those members who aren't returning to their campus this fall. Would anyone like to take that up with a minute? All right, we'll start with John, and if the other candidates would like to, please just raise your hand when he is done. John, thank you.
Andy Anderson helped design the targeted utilization program in there, and Brook parents and Brook families and Brook teachers met and exceeded the targeted utilization programs in a school with a high SPED population and building in a science curriculum. They did everything right, and the school district still shut them down. So the kind of trauma and pain and distrust of Austin ISD is deep in that way. They still believe in it, they still are part of this, but they still feel that the Austin district does not listen to them. For Metz, having your school being co-located and bringing in kids from Sanchez and then suddenly being told, well, we're going to go along with what's already been physically in place, it's a really difficult thing to challenge. And maybe some parents are excited about that, but I think it was a very difficult choice to go along with that. But really, if the district is going to ask people to live up to certain standards and you live up to those standards, and then the district rejects those standards for real estate values, it really tells you what district values.
Thank you. Would another candidate like to respond specifically to their interactions with families and students at Brook and Metz? All right, well then we will move on to our third question.